This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, gets today's show started with cases that are currently taking place that could have a large impact on agriculture and producers. Continuing the show is K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson with reminders for cattle producers. She explains what needs to be checked on their bulls and why it is important to start now. A segment of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast wraps up today's show. K-State's Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers discuss the recent Cattle on Feed report. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information about agricultural law and taxation. And to talk about it today, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Roger, we've been talking about things that happened in 2023, but now looking to what might be happening in 2024. And the first one, talking about a takings case. And in this instance, what is a taking?
Well, a taking, it involves the government, whether it's state or federal, and here we're talking about a federal case. The government has the right to take your property from you, but the Constitution says if the government does that, they have to pay you for it. And so that's in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. And
a case that really shows why that rule is important.
Yeah, we have a case out of Texas, and this case is presently before the U.S. Supreme Court. And this involves a family that's farmed the same land for over 100 years in South Texas along the Gulf of Mexico. And what happened here was that the state came in and renovated a highway and changed the surface water drainage. And the farm had never had a problem with drainage in the past, never had a problem with flooding until that state highway project. And in essence, the renovation turned that highway into a dam, and when tropical storms would occur, the water no longer drained into the Gulf of Mexico. The farm was left flooded for days. It destroyed crops, killed their cattle, and created just an absolute disaster for them.
Why is the outcome of this something that could be really important to agriculture?
Well, they sued the state for a taking, and the lower court said that you can't sue because Texas doesn't have a statute that allows you to sue. The takings has to be brought by the state. I find that somewhat remarkable. The case law goes the other way on that. There is some split of authority on that, but you don't need a statute because you have a constitution. The constitutional right that the landowner has is to assert a taking or an inverse condemnation, whatever the case might be. And I think the Supreme Court will reverse this. I don't know that it will be unanimous. I'm hoping that it will be unanimous. But the importance for agriculture is that when the government comes in and it condemns some of your property to expand a road, for example, or whatever project that the state or the federal government wants to use for a public purpose, they have to pay you for it under the Fifth Amendment. And that's the principle that we're hoping that the U.S. Supreme Court will affirm again. And that's important for agriculture because land is the number one asset. We don't produce things if we don't have land.
And Roger, something else you're keeping an eye on for 2024, a case involving taxing wealth.
Right. This is a case that, again, is before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it involves the situation of whether income tax can be imposed without a taxable event, without any type of sale or other disposition that would otherwise trigger tax. And what happened here is a corporation over in India that is known as a controlled corporation. It's a controlled foreign corporation, so a CFC as we call it. Meaning that most of the stock is owned by people in the United States or residents or citizens of the United States. And there was a law that was passed as part of the 2017 Tax Act that really created a one-time, I'll call it a repatriation tax, although it's technically something different, that said, all right, if your wealth, your value of your investment, your wealth in this instance, your investment goes up in this corporation, then we're going to tax that on a one-time basis, and we're going to pull that home. And it was deemed to be a revenue raiser in the 2017 Act to pay for a lot of the other tax cuts in that provision. And so the stock investment in this company by these people went up sufficient enough to trigger a $15,000 tax bill. Now, mind you, they didn't sell any of their stock. They get a bill from the Treasury for $15,000. This is your tax obligation. And they paid it, but now they're challenging that. So they went to court to challenge it to get a refund back, and they've lost so far, and it's before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, I think this one is key because if the court says that the government can tax your wealth without a tax event, then that brings us back to Senator Elizabeth Warren that has pushed for a number of years for a tax on wealth. And that would seem to light a fire under that and perhaps reinvigorate that attempt to try to tax wealth without a tax event. That's important for farmers and ranchers. What if you get a bill because your land value went up, for example? Can they do that? Well, we'll see what the Supreme Court says. The other issue that I'm concerned about here is if we can tax wealth, then that would seem to indicate that the Congress would be okay and might feel empowered to eliminate the step-up basis rule at death. And so instead of waiting until your heirs sell the property that they inherit and then taxing it at that time, we would impose the tax upon death before they receive the property, even though there hasn't been a taxable event. So this case is how the court decides this. And I'm not sure they're going to go clearly one side or the other. They may try to thread a needle here, and I worry about that. But this one has significant implications for agricultural producers.
So really not even money changing hands, just if something becomes more value, you have to pay taxes on it.
That's exactly what this case is about.
Another case for us to talk about that's taking place in 2024, Chevron deference, and not a fashion statement here.
No, the Chevron case goes back into the 1980s. This case is over 40 years old, or right at 40 years old now. And basically what the Supreme Court said was when we have an administrative agency that makes a regulation based on a statute, we're going to go with what their interpretation of that existing statute is, unless it is just completely out of bounds. Any reasonable interpretation we're going to uphold, and that's known as deference, Chevron deference. Chevron is the name of the case, and that's where the deference language or where the deference principle comes from that we still operate under today in large extent. Now, there have been a couple of cases in recent years where the Supreme Court has chipped away at that, but now we have two cases on the same issue in front of the Supreme Court involving the fishing industry where deference, it gives the court the opportunity to change the deferential standard substantially and maybe perhaps move away from Chevron deference. Now, that's important to us in agriculture because farmers and ranchers often get into administrative disputes with USDA or a branch of USDA, and they often lose those cases because if the court thinks that the administrative agency has made a reasonable interpretation of whatever rule is at stake, a reasonable interpretation of the overlying statute, then the administrative agency will win. If the court changes the deferential standard and lowers that standard, what that might mean then is that farmers and ranchers will have a greater likelihood of prevailing in these administrative disputes with federal government administrative agencies. So
not just an automatic shutdown of if they think something's wrong with that agency.
Yeah, it's not an automatic pass that the agency is going to get, which is often the case, and that's how farmers and ranchers feel about it. So that deferential case is real big. So we've got 3 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court that will be decided in 2024 that are going to bear on agriculture substantially.
One more thing for us to talk about today that's recently come up in this past week involving dicamba.
Yeah, here we are back again in the courts with dicamba, and of course this has to do with a court invalidating the registrations for dicamba, 3 different registrations for dicamba products. And this happened back in 2020. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit did the same thing, and EPA went back to the drawing table and kind of went through the process again and said that they had made changes, and the court disagreed with that and said, well, if you didn't go through the administrative process that is required when you register a pesticide. You have to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. You have to open things up for public notice and comment. You have to hold a hearing. And that's the same rule that's there under the federal pesticide law, FIFRA, as well as the Endangered Species Act, the court said. Now, that's a little bit unique in the case, the ESA angle on this. But they failed to do that, and so the court had no alternative other than to invalidate the registrations and tell EPA go back to the drawing board, go back through the administrative process to properly register these pesticides. Now, the problem we've got is the timing on this. The timing could not be worse. And I've already been flooded with dozens of emails and calls from cotton and soybean producers, primarily cotton producers down in South Texas, that are ready to roll out. And several of these have purchased high six-figure numbers of prepaid dicamba-tolerant seeds, which they cannot use dicamba on right now. There are alternatives, but we're going to see we could see even a worse problem with drift with the alternatives to the dicamba products. So the alternative here for the court would be, or maybe not an alternative, but what the court could do is stay their order to get us through this crop season. I don't know if they'll do that. But I think we've got a lot of people that are kind of in a holding pattern waiting on the court to say that they're going to do that or tell us they're not going to do that.
Roger, at this point, is it just the ag producers waiting to see what the courts decide?
As of right now, that's where we're at. We may be in a different spot a week from now, but there are motions before the court to stay that order. I'm sure there'll be an appeal of it, but the legal process takes time. Any appeal is not going to solve the problem for this growing season, as it takes time to get through the legal process. So it's up to the district court judge to determine whether they're going to stay their order or not.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some things that you might want to keep your eye on in 2024.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. You can read more on these topics from his recent article, The Big Issues for 2024. There are a few different places you can find it. You can do so by going to Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or you can also find it by going to AgManager.info. And of course, I will link it also in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show discussing breeding and bulls. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State beef reproduction specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Sandy, on Valentine's Day, wanting to talk about bulls and making sure they're ready for breeding season. And first, talking about making sure mature bulls are ready for breeding season. And the first point, nutrition.
That's right. We often relegate the bulls off to the side. We're focused on cows. There's more of them. We know their requirements are changing, but we also need to pay attention to the body condition score of our bulls, because we know that bulls in better body condition have a higher semen quality. So if they got thin during the breeding season, we want to make sure to take this time to get them back in a little better flesh over the winter. And of course, when we look back at some of the cold snaps we've had, we know that cattle are not going to perform as well in those temperatures. And so if nutrition was a little bit short on the bulls during that time, they may need a little extra time to really get back in that body condition score 5 or better prior to the start of the breeding season. And while, for most people, the breeding season is still quite a ways off, but it's easier to gradually increase body condition rather than say, oh, you've got 30 days till breeding and they're skinny, and try and change it rapidly. So planning ahead, making sure those bulls have adequate time to get in condition is what we want to be thinking about.
And you mentioned the semen quality, something important that kind of goes with nutrition, and something else when we're thinking about semen quality is once again mentioning those cold snaps we had.
Right. Hopefully you didn't have any issues with cold weather, but we do know that in extremely cold temperatures, if bulls are not bedded or have protection from that wind, they can get frostbite, and the severity of that can vary quite a bit. And if they get where there's scabbing at the base of the scrotum, more likely that there is damage. Now, depending on the severity of that frostbite, fertility could be permanently damaged, but in many cases they will recover. And the process of making new sperm cells and semen takes about 60 days. And so, if we were concerned about bulls that might have been injured during a cold snap, we'd want to wait at least that long to check them to see what their fertility was. And that would hold true, if we had a bull injured, ran a fever for some reason, give it that time, see if they can recover on their own before we check them. But, we want to test these bulls and make sure when we turn them out, they're ready to go to work.
And shortly we'll talk about when those breeding sadness exams should probably be done. But as we're thinking about the flip side of cattle getting too cold, can they get too hot?
Yes, it's really interesting the way the bull in particular has evolved so that the testes actually need to be several degrees cooler than the body temperature. And so the location of the scrotum is appropriate to keep those cooler than the rest of the body temperature. And there's a complex set of blood vessels that are part of that. And so as the blood is coming down to the testis, it's exposed to the cooler air. If the scrotum is further down, allows more cooling to allow that to happen. So anything that causes the temperature to get too warm in the scrotum, and we can do that experimentally, we can insulate the scrotum. It could be from extreme heat, or it could be from some type of illness that causes the animal to run a fever. All of those things interrupt the process because it needs to be cooler than the body temperature in order to happen successfully.
And thinking about bull safety and hopefully making sure everything's functioning well. Wanting to also think about if you're putting two bulls together in the same breeding pen, maybe going ahead and pairing them together before they're in with the ladies.
Right. If at all possible, we certainly like to have those bulls work out any differences well in advance of the breeding season. And sometimes that's a little challenging if we're buying some new bulls in the spring to allow that to occur. But boys will be boys, and they will have to develop their pecking order. And so, we do need to just be a realist. Those things will happen, and plan on that. And then, as I said, the challenge becomes with some of those newer bulls that we bring in. And ideally, we wouldn't mix younger bulls with more mature bulls from a standpoint of interactions in the breeding pasture, if we can avoid that. But sometimes that's not going to work. So, do it, segregate them if you can, but if not, at some point you got to deal with the consequences of pecking order.
And Sandy, you mentioned a breeding soundness exam and gave a little bit of a timeline, but when really is the time that producers should go ahead and get that exam done in relation to their breeding season? Right.
So if we think about, there's multiple things we want to think about, okay? Fertility is not a static trait, so you don't want to start checking bulls so soon that they could run into some issue, run a fever, something like that prior to the start of the breeding season. But by the same token, if we test these bulls and typically we find, 20% fail each year, that's mature bulls and young bulls, we need some time if we've got to find replacements, and hopefully, you're not hit with, I need way more bulls than I anticipated, but, you need to have some time there. So, you're looking at somewhere between maybe 30 and 60, 75 days out. Oftentimes, veterinarians will kind of have days when they maybe are testing a lot of bulls that you'd bring into the clinic, and it helps them set up with their microscope, and, they can get through a lot more bulls at a time when they can leave things set up like they need them to test bulls. So look for those opportunities, and those are often well timed for the breeding season in that area.
And as we're thinking about multiple bulls, a little bit different of an angle here as well. Beforehand, you mentioned that some companies are putting multiple bulls into one straw. And why is that?
Right. So we're seeing in some of the sex semen that's available from some of our AI companies, combining similar bulls in terms of genetic quality into one straw. And from a standpoint of understanding bull fertility, that has been done to try and differentiate between bulls that are more fertile than others. But the advantage in this situation, we know that fertility is a little bit lower when we use sex semen compared to conventional semen. And so the companies are looking at ways to anything we can do to improve that. And so one of the challenges that we have with bull fertility is that, well, one, we don't know everything we want to know about it in terms of picking them out, but we do know that there's some differences in how long those cells are viable in the reproductive tract. So when we combine multiple bulls, our hope is that we have a group of cells that are viable at a longer period of time, so that when that cow does ovulate, because while we say she's average ovulation at this time, there's variation around that. So we're trying to increase the amount of time that there's viable sperm cells there to improve the chances of fertilization and conception.
In these scenarios, would the producers then have to go back and test for that sire if they want to know who it is?
Right. You would have to DNA to identify that. But I think, probably largely aimed at commercial producers. They're combining bulls with similar EPDs. Now, can't say that I've looked at all offerings, but, we could offer a Charolais, a Hereford, and maybe a black bull. And, maybe we could tell by the offspring color what it was, but that may be a little harder to, combine some of those genetic goals with that type of package. But, the main goal is to try and improve fertility with that sex semen because, it's great to have options in not only genetics, but the sex of the calf. And so that's, I think, the goal of that is to try and improve fertility.
Sandy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information that producers might want to have on their mind when it comes to their bulls, even though breeding season is still a little ways away.
You bet. I'm glad to be here and always happy to visit.
That was K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson. If you'd like to find more information on this topic or other topics related to beef cattle, you can do that by going to ksubeef.org. You can read articles from the K-State Extension Beef Team by clicking on the Beef Tips newsletter. There you can also get signed up for that monthly e-newsletter. Also on KSU Beef, you can see some upcoming events. For example, cow-calf production clinics preparing the calf for market, McPherson County Cow-Calf School, and pond management, as well as some beef quality assurance trainings that are still taking place with K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. Also, just a reminder, on March 1st is the Kansas State University Cattlemen's Day. The day will get kicked off at 8 a.m. and be full of educational experiences until around 3 p.m. Once again, you can find all this on ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with a segment of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. Today, we're joined by Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Bob Larson.
Dustin, I know one of the things that you brought to us is there was a report that came out a couple weeks ago, and it talked about that the cattle on feed were up 4%. That's the headline and basically the report. So give us some interpretation there of what does that mean? What does that mean for us?
So I think the report actually, when it said up 4%, that was for Kansas, not the rest of the United States. So just there's a difference there. I think the for the rest of the United States, the average was up 2%. So, and that was what the pre-expectations were. So what did that do to markets? I mean, I don't think we saw any really difference. So I don't know that it caused a lot of chaos, if you will. But I mean, if you're a producer, I guess, if you want to think through what do these cattle on feed numbers mean today, if you're looking at the cattle on feed reports, probably maybe nothing today, but it's going to help think about the prices in the future, right? When those calves are going into the feed yard, they're going to be coming out in, 150 plus, give or take, days. So that will have an impact on prices for sure.
Well, it makes me, I'm asking a question here. So when I see cattle on feed numbers going up, one of the things that implies to me is, well, we're not keeping heifers out of the meat chain. We're not retaining heifers to be replacement heifers. yet, in that I don't know how strongly I can make that statement, but it certainly doesn't provide any evidence that we're keeping a lot of heifers back on the ranch to be replacement heifers yet. Am I safe saying that, or is there enough other things going on?
I think you are, because I think the actual heifers were up 2% nationally as well in that report. But that would be something I'd want to look at is, can you break that out, look at what the heifers versus steers, maybe take a look at the slaughter numbers as well, like how many cows, how many heifers are being slaughtered.
And another thing you said was it didn't surprise the market. So the market kind of had penciled in a increase, year-over-year increase, and so that was already, I'm assuming, that means that when you get a big jump in or increase or decrease in cattle on feed that wasn't expected, that's when we'd likely to see.
That's when you start to see the market adjustments, in the prices.
So how good are you guys at knowing what these are going to go?
Well,
which direction they're going to go?
Obviously, the people who must talk, right? You must be talking. People who are making these kinds of predictions, I'm assuming that they've got people out in the yards that they're talking to on a pretty regular basis saying, hey, here's who we're buying, or this is how many we're buying. Here's what we're hearing from other yards. And so if you're doing this for a living, you probably have got some contacts at your...
But a single report, sorry, Brian, a single report probably doesn't change my heifer retention strategy if I'm a cow-calf producer.
It's going to be if you see a trend month over month over
month. I'm going
month.
to see a trend, and I'm going to have a lag between anything that I do, right? If I say, there people are still selling heifers and I'm going to start retaining, it's going to be a couple of years before I see the benefits or reap any rewards from those calves.
Yes. So this is a year-over-year increase, right?
Yeah, so it would be compared to the previous 2020, January 2023.
23. So what does it look like? Is the 4% because 2023 was down and we've just kind of come back to where we are historically? Like what for overall capacity, what does that mean for like feeding capacity in Kansas? Are we getting back to where we're full, or are we now over capacity?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to the specific into Kansas if we're at where we're at.
Yeah. But that's a good point, Brian, is the year over year. You have to know where you were last year too, right? If inventory was down or if inventory was up and then it goes up again, it changes a lot. So in how you would interpret that. I think those are important. So as we think about kind of planning for the future, you have to make decisions. And if I'm hearing you correctly, Dustin, you want to make decisions for your operation, not necessarily based on pieces of news that come out once in a while.
I mean, you're talking one report, and if you're trying to retain heifers, you're talking, like you're saying, a couple years out. I don't know how much you can make out of just one single report.
Yep. Excellent. Thanks, Dustin.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.